It is the 10th of January 2020. This is an LPRG reading group meeting. We are meeting at SOAS, and the reading that we are going to be discussing is by Lucian Brown and Bodo Winter from the Journal of Politeness Research 2018, Volume 15, Number 1, pages 25 to 54. And the title is Multimodal Indexicality in Korean, Doing Deference and Performing Intimacy Through Nonverbal Behaviour.
Who wants to start?
You do.
How did you guess? Well, to sum up a lot, I found this a wonderful example of what reading research is like, because I just read the abstract and I quarrelled with about 12 things in the abstract, you know, and decided that, from my point of view, this is basically all wrong. However, on the next page, the page afterwards, anyway, I read a sentence some pages into it, which I think has solved a big problem I have, or has helped me to solve a big problem I have with the chapter of the book I'm writing at the moment. So it's amazing.
Let's see whether your problem is the same as my problem. I was going, it's all made up stuff, and then the sentence which salvaged that for me was they said, when you've got a script you're told what to say, but any non-verbal stuff is kind of left up to the actors. Mm-hmm. So the actor's interpretation...
It wasn't not that at all. That's an interesting point.
But it was the scripted thing for me was, I always huff and
problematic, yes, I do, yeah.
Well, that's yes, I see. That's very interesting. I mean, the normal way of getting around that is to say, well, look, all interaction is performance of a kind. You know, we're all performing ourselves all the time. So what if it's scripted, so to speak, and that kind of works, yeah? But that's a really important point.
So long as, yeah.
So what was your problem that got solved?
It will go off at a tangent if I mention it, but it's simply the word taboo. Actually, on page 30. No, it is disagreeing or contradicting elders. And this is, I hope, solved a problem with me with regard to my category of taboo predication, which I was wondering how to solve, and I think I've solved it. But more about that later, folks.
But so the problem of performing is sort of a false problem, isn't it? Because
I think so. Well, observer's paradox stuff and all that. We have to teach our students observer's paradox and all the rest of it. And of course, it's important because it is about basically rigour, isn't it? About objectivity and rigour. But in a way, it's a kind of false paradox, I feel, when you're studying interaction, anyway. Yeah? However, scripted is taking it to another level, of course, definitely.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think you have to if you're going to analyse scripted.
Thank you.
It's okay, as long as
they agree with me.
Your analysis or your conclusions or whatever are only referring to that genre of scripted dialogue. It only relates to that. It doesn't.
And they don't do a lot of trying to tie it down to that area. It does sound like a much broader Korean politenessy kind of spin.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, there is that argument about recognisability. That although it's scripted, if anything, it's probably going to be more stereotypical.
Yes.
It's probably not going to show the variation. That's the problem. It's not going to show the variation.
Yeah, I have some sympathy with that because probably all the body language is not scripted, actually. We don't know, but.
That's their claim.
That was Andrew's point.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's their claim, yes. But I mean, you wonder, that's their claim, it's not in the script. But what about the director?
Yeah.
I didn't even have a problem with the concept of stereotyping, because the paper is not trying to provide a quantification of behaviors, patterns of behavior. It's not trying to say this is a dominant pattern, this is a, I mean, it does say it, and that is problematic when that's the bits that you read critically and you say, but do they always do it all the time? But what it's trying to say is that some behaviors are more recognizable than others. They are typified and sometimes stereotypified. And what these behaviors get associated with are a number of certain stances. So it doesn't quite matter, I think, that we are able to say this is the dominant pattern and this is a kind of alternative pattern or subversive pattern. What we need to accept is whether they are recognized and whether the associations with polite attitudes or impolite attitudes hold true. And for me, what was interesting, although I also had a problem with generalizations that weren't warranted, what's interesting is that to a certain extent they are fairly, I hesitate to use the word universal, but recognizable across languages. So stiffness is, to me, also recognized as a more polite attitude in Italian.
Small spaces.
Small spaces, stiffness. In Italian, in English, in any language I know. So that is more interesting. It doesn't matter if it's a stereotype or not, it's just recognizable and it holds true.
Just empirical kind of thing.
But I do cringe a little bit when I read Korean society as a whole, and I think they could have done a better job in qualifying some of these statements.
I think I was a bit uncomfortable with that, in the sense that, like you say, I was recognising a lot of these and thinking, well, you know, I can see that in other societies, and it seemed a bit as if they're trying to say that this is. They weren't quite saying that, but it was very the emphasis is on Korea and Korean culture, as if it's maybe a thing that's peculiar to Korea, whereas I don't think it necessarily is. Maybe in a matter of degree.
But that's okay, isn't it? In the sense that if they present the evidence and we think it's validated, then somebody else can compare it, you know? With other cultures.
I think that's a value in this, is that I think that they're right in that, to my knowledge, there isn't much that is done in detail on non-verbal behaviour in a kind of systematic.
One of my PhD students is doing stuff on. Actually, I'm kind of on this sort of thing she's looking at American sitcom, Modern Family, and looking at Chinese Chinese subtitling for, and looking at the matches across and the conflicts between the subtitles and the thing. So obviously, I will send a copy of this on to her. But one of the things interesting was that which particular literature they've drawn on. So they've gone for the sort of social psychology, where she's using multimodal discourse analysis, which is quite a different kind of approach.
Some of that social psychology stuff is quite old, isn't it?
Yeah, and what I suppose one thing that was talking about it was that they didn't recognise that there was an alternative. They didn't say, well, there's this approach and this approach, and we're using this because. So I suspect they don't know about multimodal discourse analysis stuff, which I think is more a bit more subtle in terms of there's more gradations and more sort of more fine-grained things that can be looked at, whereas I thought this was quite broad kind of stuff.
But what is maybe specific to Korean, and I can think of I don't know Korean, but I can think of a corresponding feature in Japanese, is that these two types of behaviors, the deferential and the intimacy, map out quite neatly onto stylistic differences. So of course this is true of every language, but Japanese and Korean have explicit morpho-syntactical devices that are fairly obvious and conspicuous. And so these two styles,
so like the honorifics,
appear to correlate with one or the other. So it's more conspicuous perhaps. So it's always a matter of difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that is maybe the language and culture specific aspect of this particular case study. And there was one comment towards the end. We were talking about universality of this of the use of space. There was a section on. Let me try and find it. So this was this comment where I wondered whether indeed it was universally true or not. And I'll find it in a television so that I don't want to go into a conversation. In the use of eyebrows, maybe? Never mind, I'll get back to it if I find it.
Well, it's interesting that you say it maps that the doing deference towards status superiors and performing intimacy towards status equals maps quite well onto Japanese habits and norms, I suppose, as well, yeah? Because this is one of the things I quarrelled about sort of theoretically, in a way, you know, to make that assumption that intimacy is to do with equals. You know, I mean, Brown and Emerson do the same thing as well, actually, you know?
Yes. I've said careful, intimacy isn't the same as symmetrical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
You know,
no,
and
yeah.
I thought, I believe I have even written that you see, you're suggesting I'm wrong, actually.
No, I was
that is where Brown and Emerson could be accused of ethnocentrism. Because of that assumption of that conflation, you know? And I assumed it was Western, but perhaps
But
it isn't.
even in Western culture, it's not.
No, exactly. Yes.
Parents and children.
Exactly.
Grandparents and children.
Yeah.
Yes.
Quite.
I was referring only to linguistic forms and styles, not to norms of behavior.
So in a way, you're referring to sort of like
so there's two
up from
distinct-
first order norms, you mean? Sort of what people, as in this paper, what people are taught, so to speak.
No. The parallel I was thinking of was between this doing deference with one, mapping out one particular morphosyntactic style and doing intimacy with another one. So it was a very conspicuous set of markers, linguistic markers that appear and that seem to correlate with nonverbal
In other words, you're talking about the doing deference and the performing intimacy, not necessarily who it's done or performed with.
And the non-verbal mapping onto the verbal. But I was also thinking that, for example, in the surveys, several surveys, including one that I did, of synonyms of politeness that are produced in by lay users of the languages. So if you ask people, what do you think of when you hear polite, and you do that in Japanese and in English, the word friendly appears in the English surveys, but never ever in the Japanese. So politeness is not equated with intimacy as a matter of stereotyping or metapragmatic stereotypes in Japanese, and I suspect in Korean as well. Whereas you can be polite and friendly in English, so there's a kind of intersection there of something that isn't deference, is intimacy, but still kind of not.
In Dutch, or Flemish Dutch anyway, the equivalent of friendly seems to be used in quite a lot of situations where I would imagine in English they'd use the word polite as well.
Right.
So perhaps there's an even closer connection.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, interesting. Yeah. So, yes, I understand your criticism, but I also understand where this assumption comes from. And it again comes from a stereotype of deference. That it is nonetheless rather strong, and there are formulae, there are proverbs that reinforce the stereotype.
Yeah.
So it's think there's probably a word for it. It's very kind of explicit in the language and the culture. People recognise it and talk about it, and which is that's the problem that I have when people say, it's a minor point really, but people, ordinary people will sort of say that we don't defer to the elderly in the West. Well, we do. We just don't label it in the same way.
It isn't an explicit maxim. So to speak.
Well, it's not as strong in the West as it is in the East.
It's a matter of degree, definitely, but it still is there. It's still in the language and the non-verbals.
But I think it tends to be perhaps where there is deference to older people, it tends to perhaps be within your family, rather in the UK.
Than stranger empathy.
Than strangers, yes. In fact,
Not necessarily.
Well, there's also.
I think you have both. I think you can have lack of respect as well.
Yeah,
at the same time.
I think there's an awful lot of dismissing of older people in the UK society.
There's a lot of ageism, certainly.
Yeah, but just to say.
But I'm still thinking
They become profane people, government's terms, Sometimes old people are treated profanely.
Yes. So I don't think there is that assumption that an older person by default gets respect, whereas in and I know only from what I've read about Eastern cultures, whereas that's much more.
But I think for me, what the difference is that it is much more explicit and recognised. To me,
this is the sentence that I referred to at the beginning. It says, as you argued by Brown, the same Brown in 2011, the idea of elder respect in the Korean context is qualitatively different to corresponding Western notions in that disagreeing with, contradicting or causing discomfort to elders is largely taboo.
I think it's a quantitative difference, not a qualitative one. I think maybe we do it, perhaps not to the same degree, but...
I don't think that you can ever pin it down that way, though. I think what is more relevant is how recognized the discourses about age are. And so I think where he's coming from is the awareness of a lot of discourses. I mean, just like in Japan, if you start talking about Japanese language, people will have a whole range of narratives about what it means to, speak politely and how polite the Japanese people are. So there are these discourses that get circulated and reinforced by, repetition, and that is what you use as it teaches us to do other things, right? So because you have these discourses at your disposal, you can then judge people on whether they stick to that or not, or read through them. And that is on an ad hoc basis. Maybe yourself are not even coherent in the way you produce these evaluations, but on one occasion you can invoke this narrative, and the next you invoke that narrative. And that is important, and I don't think we use that notion enough in our research. So we are very concerned about what people really do, but to me that is it's a measure of what is normal in a statistical sense, but it's not qualitatively interesting. What is interesting is how widely these discourses can be plucked out of thin air at the moment you
and
need
of
them.
course that's about the interpretation of what people do by participants.
And also, I don't know, like if it's related, but in the Japanese case, I would add that there's a significant divide between what is perceived to be the polite way to say things and how people actually use it. Because I know many Japanese people that have a good degree, but I speak honorific Japanese better than they do. And so I feel that in my interaction with the Japanese language, sometimes what you are exposed with as really correct honorific Japanese is something that you either see on paper or in crafted discourse, maybe on television. And dramas, because so I think it relates a bit to what you were saying, so that we may also diversify what the perception of how a certain linguistic politeness should be and what actually happens, because I feel that I don't know as the Korean language as well to be able to make a broader statement, but as far as it concerns Japanese, I would say that it is also very relevant how these forms are perceived to be rather than how they're actually used.
Yeah.
as some
But I
kind of
think-
cultural
Yeah.
reality.
Yeah. In general, though, we tend to think that real data of actual language use is more reliable than commentaries, metapragmatic comments. And what I'm thinking now is that
But
actually
it is more
a big
reliable,
deal.
but is it more significant?
It is not, yeah, exactly,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. And this is socially very significant. So I think for me, what they say here is not a problem as such. The problem is that it's not presented as the metapragmatic commentary that it is, and it doesn't elaborate enough on the purposes of these discourses. It just makes very categorical statements. But the fact that there is a perception that some things are taboos in itself is data. It's interesting as a piece of data. And my problem was with the use of page 26. It says, all things being equal, the speaker who employs politeness routines in a quiet tone of voice while smiling and bowing the head is likely to be perceived as polite, whereas the speaker who shouts and produces obscene gestures will be perceived as impolite. So we all know what they mean, and we all know that there's definitely some reliable association there, but whether that behavior is necessarily equated with politeness or impoliteness is very questionable, right? Or obscene, what's obscene? That's not been problematized in the paper, so that is my problem.
Yes.
I've just found that sentence very problematic. It's very imprecise. It's like what shout politeness routines, or because you were saying what he's trying to say is the mode of saying is as important as the saying.
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually. That's not actually what that says.
Yeah.
It's kind of it's smuggling into potentially changes in language as well as the changes in, or it's not sufficiently precisely differentiating those things.
Yeah.
And that thing that they are saying, which I found useful in this paper, is this collapsing of morphosyntax, prosody, bodily stuff, all clusters together to give, and I think their word is a robust indication of an indexing of the situation, which makes evolutionary sense to me. If you're going to be in a hostile environment and you want to show people that you're not hostile, you want to have multiple systems in place. So that robustness was a good thing. Related to that, out of that, I think, which I found useful, is when you've got multiple systems, that allows you to mess with one or two of them to do the mocking, where you counteract different systems inappropriately. So I found that was a useful contribution.
For which you need stereotyped patterns. So unless you know what is typical, you can't tell what is
and relying on your addressee recognising those stereotypes as well, or those kind of those sort of typicality models, because otherwise, without that, they're going to misunderstand. So it is nice in that kind of precise form of that it's kind of which I love to use.
Nice as neatness.
Yes, it's nice.
Precision.
Precision, that it kind of unpacks that bit. I mean, it doesn't manage it all the way. There are moments where it kind of really unpacks those things, and other moments where it's all a bit too mushed together. But it is a very, very complex phenomenon that they're trying to unpack. So that that kind of, that sort of not managing to keep that separated all the time is not unreasonable.
One of the examples they gave, which I wish they'd given just a little bit more detail, and to be fair, I didn't go to the reference list to try and work it out from the reference, but the research that they cited, which says there was an experiment done and XDY%, 74% or something large, was recognised as polite even without the yod particle. Now, I don't know whether that was experimentally designed where it was yod and then filtered out, and therefore you could hear it without the particle. But that idea of robustness is you can plug into reliable markers somewhere else without it necessarily being any one of these morphosyntactic systems.
which also perhaps matches what you were saying about the Japanese people not using the full set of honorifics that you would expect, given grammatical expectations about use of honorifics, but that they're not being perceived as being impolite, presumably.
Yeah.
Well, I'm now going to betray the fact that I haven't read this paper properly, but picking up on that, all the headings are the various non-verbal behaviours.
Yes.
It's mostly quantitative, isn't it?
Yes.
The analysis. Multimodal surely means that you, as the robust thing means, you do all at the same time, don't you?
Yeah, I mean that was one of
Is there any analysis in here of this single strip of
With something
interaction
else now, I don't
with
know.
the words,
No,
with the
I
non-verbal
mean,
behaviour?
I did have some problems with the quote.
There's that Bob Arundel's quote, isn't there? Or I've tried to quote it, I can't. But anyway, the thing is that there aren't two separate systems here. There isn't a non-verbal system and a verbal system. They're all wrapped up together, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I did have some issues with the. There were times where I'm thinking, I think one of the first stats they used is the chi-square, and they sort of said, we know we shouldn't really use it in this context, but we've used it anyway. It's like, no, if it doesn't really fit the context, just don't use it. And I find that it's this kind of. I thought the statistics in here were probably problematic. That a statistician would look at this and go, and a part of me just saying, what was to say, just use numbers. Sometimes using stats if they're not really
29 versus noughts, that's a fairly good indication.
Yes, you don't then need to turn it into percentages and plot a chi-square. Yeah, exactly.
Because in many cases they're saying, actually this isn't a very good statistics, but it's kind of coming out quite strongly. And you're going, but if it's not a very good statistics, whether it's coming out strongly or not, does it not actually make a difference? And I do have a problem with that there is this kind of move towards quants in linguistics, but it's this idea that any use of quants makes your work more robust, and I just don't really think that's true. Use them when they're appropriate to be used.
Couldn't agree more.
But I think, go back to the point, I don't remember a point where there is any this thing with another thing. I think each one is presented as a separate.
I mean, they just don't have it. They just can't use that kind of mixed method analysis because the data doesn't allow it.
Well, the data does allow it. I mean, they've got.
Well, not in terms of statistics.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But yeah,
they've got video recordings in front of them.
They
could analyse a couple of 10-second strips with everything,
Yeah. So they could use more sort of tabular to kind of thing to look at interactions more. And that would have been.
But I think I would have objected if there hadn't been some sort of statistical, or at least an indication of significance, because.
Statistical significance.
Yes.
Right.
Because of P. If they had just listed numbers, I would have wondered, is this statistically significant or not, regardless of the sample size, which is what it is, of course. So to me, this doesn't interfere with their other claims. It's just a kind of an extra.
But see, if you can only statistical significance only has any validity if the test being used is appropriate. If the test isn't really appropriate, then statistical significance tells you nothing.
Absolutely, but I don't think that's what the paper focuses on. It's not the quantification of the it's just the size. And by the way, this happens to be.
I still felt it was kind of sitting there and saying, look, it's significant, therefore that's fine, and now we'll look at what. Whereas, I think that if you're going to use those bits, they needed more hedging really about.
I think there is a sense that we have to. I mean, we people interested in qualitative studies, we have to sort of justify our claims to the broader, linguistic community and say at least this is not contradicted by a quantitative measure. And I think, either you just speak to people like you who would be happy without numbers, or you.
I happily use statistics. It's not normative statistics, but I can see holes in the way they're using. In the particular tests they're using. I think it's something that's quite questionable. And I'm not a good statistician, but it's like you just shouldn't really use it.
The clue where they actually say this isn't a very good test, that's a good clue.
Well, I know, exactly. And there's some other points later on where they're using Wilcox and sign ranks, and the way they've done it, it's just like if I was going to use Wilcox and sign ranks, I wouldn't have done it in the way, because you've lost so much more information the way you've merged data points. So there are just problems with it. I have no. If you can use stats and use it well, then that's great. But I don't think you should use it just because you think it makes your work look better if it really isn't on solid foundations. And that's my problem with it.
Okay.
I also wondered about the reason why they chose those particular tests, because it did seem to be inconsistent.
Why they chose those particular
tests?
Yeah.
One moment it was chi-squared, and then
Well, chi-squared and also Wilcox and sign ranks do different things.
because it was one day binomial, was it? I think where
Yeah.
you assess it against your expected results.
Yeah.
Yes,
Which is also a bit odd.
Yeah.
So there were just some issues. It didn't feel like a very solid use of statistics to me, and then to kind of fall from that quite a lot. That was my problem with it.
Well, while we're doing a bit of dissing then, I've got two other things that I found problematic. There's a portion where they talk about people mostly being on the same plane, both sitting, both standing, right? And I thought, yeah, okay, fair enough. But also think that this is telly, and they absolutely say that Korean TV is a lot of close-up shots. So if you're going to have a different plane, you've got to have a wider shot, right? So there are implications of how you photograph it and what you can have. So that was one of my issues. And another issue was when they were talking about subordinates coming into the office and the person staying sat down while the other person's. I'm thinking, well, hang on, if this is TV, you've got to do this scene quite quickly. So you can't even bring them in and sit them down and have a discussion, because you need to turn it around quite quickly. So they've got to come in, do their thing, and then walk out again. To sit down takes scene time, air time.
And was there a seat they could have sat in?
Indeed.
I mean, so I was reading this, and the previous day, having gone into one of the admin offices upstairs, which has 2 people in it, and I went into to raise an issue about, there was a problem, so I gone in. And no, I didn't sit down, but the person was entirely on the same level, I would have thought of us as peers, no real difference in status. But, I mean, actually there wasn't a chair to hand particularly, and also I was going in to do something quick.
Yeah, that's right. So, yes, it was the speed thing for me, and therefore it takes away the strength of argument that, oh, look what's happening here, because I'm going, well, there are other reasons why it might be happening like that.
Yeah, I think you need to look into more detail about, were people staying where you were standing when it would have seemed more appropriate to sit, or there was no kind of consideration of that. So sometimes I felt that there was kind of details lost on that I would have liked to have
But
seen.
they do have all sorts of combinations, right? So they have scenes where people are both standing, both sitting, one standing, one sitting, and vice versa. So it's not like they.
Well, it's not that it doesn't exist, no.
You would probably notice if something was done in a so-called inappropriate way, right? So yes, I take your point about the technical setup affecting what you can and cannot film, but you wouldn't want to produce effects, undesirable effects.
Sure,
right?
and that's I've forgotten who said it, somewhere down there. The recognisability.
Yes. So I guess I'm a lot less critical than you are, because I'm thinking I've actually enjoyed what they've done with the material they have, and they.
I just wanted more details. So with that kind of the office situation, it's like, well, how many of these were, the superior coming in, or what I wanted that data.
Of course, practically, the answer why is they've got 7,000 words to
Well, this is my mind. I always want people to write more. To be
so write a 13,000 word paper.
Yeah, well, that's my problem.
I was intrigued by an observation that I didn't have the time to follow up, when they say that for men, smiliness is associated with intimacy, and for women with deference.
What is?
Page 39.
Men smiling is intimacy, women smiling is deference.
Yeah. And that again, there's a statistically reliable association of gender and status. So apart from the critique of the quantity.
Do they make a distinction men to men, men to women, women to women, women to men? Or?
These are all same sex.
Oh, same sex. I
Yeah.
see. Yeah,
And they're all late 20s or early 30s, so it's a very specific demographic.
Yeah, but that's what you do when you
Sure.
need to fix some variables,
Yeah.
and otherwise you write another paper. So, but yeah, that is again it kind of rings a bell because yes, the same form doesn't mean the same thing to different speakers of different genders. So that applies also to smiling, and it's quite interesting. So even nonverbal behavior is gendered. And we know that too intuitively, but this is a kind of
It's sort of perhaps a non-verbal equivalent of giving a compliment. Very different.
Yes, and so I think we haven't got enough analysis of what all these non-verbal behaviors mean, and we recognize them, but we're not necessarily aware of them, and we are.
We only notice it's probably that classic thing that we only notice it when it doesn't fit with what we're expecting in some way. So we also notice stuff about needs to get, needs to get. I've been on the tube a couple of times, watching the gendered behaviour on public transport generally, the gendered behaviour around, position of knees.
Yes,
it's just
manspreading.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Now, has anybody been watching Tim Minchin's 8-part road trip across Australia drama called Upright?
No.
Okay, it doesn't really matter then. Most recent episode, he got into trouble with a woman who was a bit of a ballsy woman and a scary woman, and there was one scene where she straddled a bench and she sat down like this and I thought, crikey, this is demonstrating something akin to this anti-knees together.
Power sitting.
Power sitting.
So I thought there was a lot of kind of gender stuff to unpack here in terms of, obviously they're looking at same-sex conversations and they can't cover it all. Yeah. Inevitably, so that was obviously an area that, we know that NBC generally needs much more research, but that you can't ignore the gender issues here, or gendered practices, gendered behaviours, and how that really they do about how they're interpreted. What smiling does.
Well, eyebrow movements. I don't know that I have any conscious understanding of what eyebrow movements do.
What you do with your eyebrows.
I mean, I have an unconscious one, I'm sure, but I cannot verbalize.
Well,
I'm
to the
sure that
extent
cross-culturally
frowning and raising eyebrows, but the other more subtle ones.
Yeah.
I mean, cross-culturally, I suppose it's not just that you have different types of men and women, but also different particular types of non-verbal behaviour will be more or less salient in different cultures. You say eyebrow movements. In Greece, a certain kind of raised eyebrow movement is simply a way of saying no. I mean, it's encoded kind of thing. So presumably it'd be much more salient there to behave like that, to people who know about eyebrow movements. Whereas, as you say, you don't notice, I don't notice them or not consciously,
And there's something about chins, doing deference by raising chins, which I also never paid
deference
attention.
with a chin. Well, that sounds difficult.
That's the bit I can't find. I marked it somewhere. Yes. Page 28, top of page 1. A smaller signing space and a lowered. This is sign language. Sorry. This is sign language.
Right.
And this is actually Georgian Japanese. The reason I marked this was because I thought that even if we're talking about a different language, the smaller sign-in space fits in with the idea of a more confined space for deference, but the forward-leaning chin is counterintuitive, although of course we need to see what it means within the context of sign language. But that's one feature that doesn't necessarily travel across languages for me, not in an intuitive way. Whereas the smaller sign-in space does somehow. And yes, actually, a specialist of Japanese sign language was supposed to come today, but couldn't come. on, so that's a shame because we could have asked her to comment on this.
I don't know where to fit this comment, but it kind of falls back, rides on your comment about different things doing different things. The same thing doing different things. And the one I picked up was the difference of gaze or gaze aversion. So the default seems to be the inferior will gaze quite a lot at the superior, unless they're being told off.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then it's gaze aversion. So you've got to work out what the function of the...
So that's an argument, isn't it, for putting them all together at the same time? And,
Yes.
So yes, just to count gaze aversion or gaze, whatever the opposite of aversion is, engagement, in a lump of numbers is problematic for picking up those
what they mean.
subtleties. Yeah.
Which is in fact the same problem with language, though, because a form in itself doesn't really mean anything, right?
Yeah.
So you need to look at it in the context. And, so I'm thinking of Aga's idea of deviations that carry meaning, and in relation to what is normalized and stereotyped, and then some obtains meaning by being different, whether it's verbal or non-verbal behavior. What else?
Can I raise another possible quarrel? That I know that, as I understand it, purports to be simply a reporting of empirical observation, basically, yeah? But even in the abstract, there are sort of terms which are interpretative rather than simply, I'm thinking specifically of suppression of gestures, it says, you know? How do you know that a gesture has been suppressed, if you see what I mean? Because
you only know that it
that
doesn't
means it's not there, right? But
Where is it talking about?
well, it's in the abstract, you see.
bang in the middle of the halfway down the abstract.
It says, when behaving towards status superiors, suppression of gestures and touching. Yeah.
What you mean is there's fewer
Absence of, yes.
Yes, I mean,
Which is not the same as
Sense
suppression.
no,
Yeah.
I mean, am I just quibbling about the words here? Is that
Yes.
it? Oh, okay,
Yeah.
fair enough.
I don't
Forget it.
I think they just misspoke.
Yeah. And presumably it's the same with decreased animatedness. They just simply mean less.
Yes.
Less than the other
Yes.
kind. Yeah,
I think so.
yeah. The thing is, I personally generally have something of an aversion to. This is the first thing I marked. You know, multimodal. I have an aversion to the because everything's multimodal. You know, why do you need to flag it? I mean, what you can flag is if, for example, if you are studying email correspondence, you know, then it's interesting because some of the multimodality is cut out, it's reduced, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah, but the fair point he's making is that
the analysis is going to be, it's not just the words, I know.
And
it's just a prejudice I have.
Yeah, but it's also, because it's, okay, none of us, it's one of those classic things that none of us would say that these things weren't important, but the reality is they haven't been thoroughly analysed.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it's Jonathan Culpepper's made the same.
And of course, you know, words are much easier to study, aren't they?
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, until fairly recently, the sort of access to video or stuff would have been quite probably, you had to have special cameras and I mean, the audio recordings. I mean, the point at which you needed a specific audio recording device, which probably not many people had. Now most of us have something like this, which you can just record. In fact, for most of our students, unless they're doing anything very technical, we would say,
On the phone.
just record it on your phone. Whereas before it was like, well, you can check out recorder and blah blah blah.
Well, I mean, as recently as 1991, 92, when I did my master's thesis, I did video data because video was sexy.
Yeah.
You know, nobody was doing it, so you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it probably required far more work to do it, and you know, all those kind of things.
Mhm.
Yeah. Sorry, Barbara.
No, it's all right. I'm actually trying to talk about other modalities, non-verbal modalities in this book that is in theory. And I was interested in this methodology that they adopted, which I think was actually good, efficient, let's say. I think efficient is the word. And I was reading a work by a Japanese linguist called Minami Fujio, who lists all the possible channels you can use to convey politeness. So this is a kind of 1980s book, and it's not very precise in its definitions, but the list goes on for 2 pages, because practically everything means something, right? And it's got anything from language to body posture to using a channel rather than the other. They didn't have internet at the time, but that would of course now feature as well. But also pauses, silences, the color of the of your clothing, etc., etc. So it goes on forever, right? So we have a problem because we have to document semiosis, and users are clearly conversant with various types of semiosis. We just haven't documented them well enough.
Yeah.
And in relation to this, I was talking about this in a class, and I showed a photo that I took of a Japanese woman in kimono. So a traditional, actually it was a yukata, but a traditional kind of yukata. And she's got an umbrella, not a parasol, and then she has this very punkish haircut. And so I was talking about the lack of correspondence in different semiotic systems, and I showed it to a class, and a discussion developed of features that I hadn't really paid attention to. So they were commenting on the fact that this was not a young woman but an elder, and this was a photo from behind. So they just saw part of the neck, and they decided that was an older woman's neck, and that had meaning, of course, for having a punkish haircut, right? And then they commented about the color of the parasol, which I hadn't even noticed. So, you know, we read into everything, and not everybody pays attention to the same features, but because every mismatch means something else, we need to be able to document the kind of regularities that this paper actually tries to establish. And this is, I think, for me, it's a good template, because it establishes...
Because then you can identify mismatches.
Exactly, in a kind of more generalizable way than we can do now. We simply got an inventory of this the semiotic systems as sophisticated as the one we have for language, for example. So we have, 100 years of studies on Keigo, or on Japanese honorifics, but nowhere near that for other semiotic systems. So, so I thought this was actually far less critical than you guys.
No, I mean, I still think it's an interesting paper, and I like the fact that obviously this is built on quite a lot of research about politeness in Korean generally, so that you could sort of make reference to what was going on in the language in general, and with the thing about that issue of homogenising culture as a way of doing stuff, which you always have to be aware of. But it was at least sort of you could see this as a process of building, of doing stuff about Korean linguistic politeness, and then developing that outreach to now look at other systems as well. And I like that element of the paper. So it's not a bad paper by any means.
No.
And it does try and say something. I mean, sometimes some papers you read and you think, well, so what? Whereas it has
that's very important.
Yeah,
yes.
Whereas there is stuff in here.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It raises lots of questions, but there's stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I haven't read loads of stuff about Korean, but I do remember a paper that Hatfield and Hahn, is it? which is about Korean politeness, and definitely went on about being polite to elders as a very big discourse, particularly in Korea. Yeah.
Right.
Maybe they have no need to cite it here. But something else which isn't cited here, and I'm afraid I can't remember details, so maybe it doesn't work, but Miriam Locker and somebody else in the interpersonal pragmatics book. Is it? No, or is it in the special issue of the Journal of Pragmatics on Interpersonal Pragmatics? I can't remember. One of the two. There's an article by Miriam Locker and somebody which purports being multimodal analysis and is have a look at it.
And
yeah?
Sage.
Huh?
Sage, Graham.
No, they're the editors of
Yes.
the
Do you
interpersonal
think
pragmatics
so?
book. I think maybe it's I think it's in that special of the Journal of Pragmatics. Now I come to think of it. Locker and I can't remember. I'm sure it had I'm afraid I don't remember any details, but a system of doing multimodal analysis in there. Can't remember the other name. But if I'm right, then it'd be what, 2013?
She publishes too much, damn it.
Yes, I agree.
This involves far too much scrolling.
How dare she?
Yeah, I know. Just making the rest of us look bad, which is not fair.
Yeah. I'm sure I'm not making this up. It's just that I can't remember where it is. Exactly, for sure. I'm afraid I can't remember any details about what the system was or anything.
I can't see anything in 2013.
What are you searching? Just Locker and multimodal?
You could try that.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
The Interpersonal Pragmatics book is 2008. Is that what it's called? Yes, it is called Interpersonal Pragmatics. The edited book is 2008. But I think it's the 2013 myself. Well, it doesn't really matter because I can't tell you anything about it. So I was hoping somebody else knew
Well,
about
there's
it.
something called Relational Work in the Interpersonal Pragmatics, published in Journal of Pragmatics in 2013.
Is that just Locker or is it Locker and somebody?
Oh, and then there's Langlotz and Locker.
That's it.
But it just says the role of emotions in relational work.
That's what it was, yeah. It's the role of emotions.
Locker
I
and-
think
Oh, right,
it's-
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, I was thinking from what
So maybe, sorry.
Okay.
I think that had some analysis that went beyond the words.
Okay.
That's all.
Right.
But as I say, I can't remember any details about it, so it doesn't really matter.
I hadn't thought about self-touching as an obvious category to analyze actually.
Well, it's funny that, isn't it? Because is that you think is that like is it Goffman's distinction between giving information, giving off information, or something like that?
Yeah.
You would have thought it's just giving off, but maybe it isn't. I put my hand on my heart. Yeah. So that's one thing. There must be individual things like that which are intentionally communicative.
I mean, it's quite a thing in the social psychology of non-verbal behaviour.
Yeah.
It's these
Oh,
sorts
yeah,
of things, you know.
Yes. They are Goffman's side involvements, aren't they? I think.
Soto and her hair.
Soto and her hair, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
What's
Yeah, I
that?
can't do that.
The Penelope Soto data that we looked at, she,
Right.
the young girls.
Playing with her long
Right.
hair
Right.
in front
So
of the
that's
judge.
a sign of insecurity, is it? I mean, stereotypically.
well,
Well,
Depends
in
how you
that
take
particular
it.
context, it was because she had no other props available. If you see what I mean, because she was standing in an empty space.
Yes, you-
But that's an interesting one because I mean what they don't do here because that's not what they're doing is talk about how things are interpreted, how things are taken up. So something like, and any non-verbal sign will say, like touching the hair, it can be taken up.
Yeah.
In lots of it can have different meanings depending on
The viewer.
the interaction. And
Yeah.
so it could be, I think, somebody could look at it, well, she's, could take it as a cheeky sign or that she's being flirtatious, because quite often people take it as flirtation, don't they? Do that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well,
there's an interaction of
there is an
negotiation,
interaction. That's
meaning
another
of-
thing, of course. One's imagining about how other people might take one's behaviour.
Exactly, yeah.
I sometimes get worried that I find myself, as I did just then, sitting like this, and I'm thinking, does it look bad that one of my hands is hidden? And I should have them on the table, So, do you see what I mean? What I'm doing there is projecting possible interpretations.
Yeah.
And none of us
my
have
behaviour.
noticed you.
You will now. Shot myself in the foot there.
But yes, you have normative elbows off the table, is that the phrasing?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Don't put
Normative
your
Slowly.
Don't put your elbows on
Oh, yes,
the
yeah.
table.
Down the back
yeah.
of your mind.
Yeah.
So sometimes I do slouch and I think, oh my god, elbows constantly. Because you're, in situations where you're self-conscious. Yeah. So what Goffman says about that is
No, I can't remember. I'm sure he does somewhere.
But that takes you back to the point of the Korean having
mottos.
Mottos, yes. That I'm sure all of us, probably not Matthew, but were brought up by saying, don't put your elbows on the table.
Yeah.
I never say that to my kids at all.
Right, but you know it.
I know it, but it's not being transmitted down the generations.
Yes.
Were you
Yeah.
ever told to not have your elbows on the table?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Nicely brought up.
But, so it's slightly aside, but funny to my parents-in-law sort of say, when my partner was kid, their grandparents blah all around the table, and grandparents said, take your elbows off the table, and both parents go. So even though they're probably telling their kids to do it, not to do it,
Yeah, exactly. But
Yeah,
yes,
so
so
it's something
that's it's cultural change. Isn't it?
Well, and one sentence. What page are we on? Page 47. Towards the bottom of middle of 47, there's a citation of Kim Renault, who's pointing out that being overtly power conscious, subservient, or self-effacing is falling out of favour in modern day Korea. This is 2001 already. So this is best part of 2 decades ago, already falling out of favour, and yet in the data that they're showing, because it's enculturated or stereotypically representational, is I wondered whether it's still doing the job of doing that codifying, recodifying.
Sure. Yes. So that's the bits that I think they could have possibly elaborated a little bit more, because there is already a lot on, for example, of the representation of women in TV drama, and the objection to the way they are stereotyped and constant, and in some norms constantly reproduced. They don't really go into that analysis at all. So they just sort of neutrally presenting demonstrable associations and refraining from commenting on the ideological choices made in the planning of the what's it called?
Screenplay.
What's it called?
Screenplay?
The script, or the screenplay. Writing, no, screen. I forget the word. Come si chiama? Il Canovaccio?
Isn't the screenplay the whole
Screenplay.
with non-verbals and everything? It's kind
Yes.
of, whereas the script is
I would say
all
yes.
the dialogue.
Yes,
Ah.
yes.
And screenplay is what? How you write down the
Yes.
action.
But yeah, yeah, we could argue why have these characters being made to behave the way they have been.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose go back to the thing about standing sitting. So you know, and I think it's what would be in the kind of script that an actor sees. You know, I mean, obviously the word's going to be in there, but you know, you're not going to get stuff probably about raising eyebrows and things. But you are likely to get stuff about whether you're going to be standing or sitting.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So not all of those things are going to be equivalent.
Yeah, there used to be a creative writer in our department who wrote crime drama, specifically police, and actually that's slightly irrelevant, but it's a conversation I had with him about that I've noticed that in most police dramas, when the police are interviewing a suspect or someone that's related to the crime, quite often those people do not stop what they're doing. They'll like go to their workplace and they'll be like, right, I want to talk to you about such and such, and they're like, oh right, and then say, anyway, I've got to go now. I'm like, that would never happen, surely, if the police came to you to interview you about murder. You give them your full attention. You know.
At least that's what you did last time you were here.
And why? There's some kind of, must be some kind of. I mean, he didn't give me an answer as to why that happened. He just sort of said, "Oh yeah, you're right, aren't you?" But there must be some kind of dramatic reason why they do it that way. But that just goes to show, emphasise that point that this may not actually reflect what people.
I think it relates to what you were saying, like because of screen time and stuff, like because maybe for screen economy, if you had like a police man interviewing somebody else, and he would stop, like, okay, let's go sit, and it would be I don't know, very bad filmmaking, I guess, because it would be one shot behind the shoulder, another one, another.
So there's a number of things that we accept just as being conventional in this TV
some people
genre.
do. I don't. It really annoys me.
I thought maybe it could be a way of enacting power, interactive power. You know, you don't really pay attention
Well, it's partly
to the person you're talking
about. I think it's showing indifference, but then the number of times that people do it, it's like, and these are characters who aren't necessarily particularly stroppy or defiant towards authority or anything like that. They're just kind of ordinary members.
I'm going to come back to my photographing thing, because I've just remembered an example that I heard once of somebody giving a paper about Casablanca. So it was Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, and I'm going to come and use that because we're sufficiently intimate for me to have to. But they had a close-up shot.
Ingrid.
So there's Ingrid Bergman and there's a close-up shot. It could have been, it might have actually been Brief Encounter.
Right.
Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But there was a close-up shot. And in order to get the close-up shot, we're close here, right? But in order to get the photographic close-up shot, you have to really bizarrely weird.
Yes. Well, I mean, I've got we've got this that uranium continent project we're involved with. We kind of were having a little discussion with each other, and I felt we literally like this, you know. But then when you looked at it on film, you look far apart. Well, film and video, but you know, so I guess there is also that effect as well.
I've heard filmmakers say that you have to stand unnaturally close.
Right.
To people
Okay.
as a
No for me then.
Right.
As well as putting, was it half a stone on you or something as well?
Do we need to really walk around with a phone and video people to do this kind of study in a way that isn't affected by the conventions of the genre, right?
Yeah, but we can't, can we? Because of ethical
limitations. It's not easy to find the right format for this kind of.
I think the point, the punchline is, what's the punchline? The emerging field of multimodal impoliteness. And I think you've always got to start somewhere. And so you shouldn't slag people off for not doing it as well as it could have been done, because they've started doing something.
Yeah, exactly. So you know, it's a first step, and it's going to take a long time get the multimodal kind of stuff up to, and the fact that we do have better technologies for this to be researched, although access to data is not necessarily very easy, but we have the technological means to gain the data. But you do kind of think, well, I mean, maybe this isn't true. I just think, people forget about oral recorders. I don't know if are they going to forget so easily about cameras, or are cameras just so?
Well, they will when they become these little GoPros that just sit there.
Yeah.
In my PhD doctoral research a long time ago, I did use some video.
You were really trailblazing then.
Actually, it didn't make it into my doctoral thesis, but anyway, I still have the data. And I actually found that in a lot of cases, people were happier to be filmed than they were to be just audio.
Really?
Yeah.
Because that's not our experience. We've been trying for years to set up to record mediation sessions, and we want them to be videoed. And about 2 years ago, we thought we had it all set up with a group in London, and then they pulled out of it. And I think it was because we wanted to video it, as not merely orally record. That's interesting. What was the reason?
Well, I don't know exactly the reason, and I can't now remember the specific context. It was obviously some healthcare context, but I got the feeling it was because the audio recording put what seems to their perception put much more emphasis on the way you sound and the way you talk, which is much more threatening. But they were used to having photographs taken. They're used to being represented in photographs, and that's okay. But not used to hearing themselves. Yeah,
it's funny, and I suppose, exactly what we've been saying in a way, they probably feel that when you've got the multimodal stuff, then they will be more faithfully represented, as it were, than just their voices, which is, I suppose, a make-weight to the thing about easily identified, which is the reason you assume that they wouldn't like video, Interesting.
Although we have all this media capture stuff, all our lectures are recorded, and in the bigger lecture theatres it's video as well as sound, and I always strip the video out. Because we have the means to do that, just take out the video.
We have the same thing that we can, it's completely up to us but it is a case of switching it off. It's on. But we have the right to switch off. The interesting thing is when it first came in, I always switched it off, on a sort of Goffmanian perspective that I didn't want there to be effectively overhearers to this event, because I would be aware of the overhearers,
Yeah.
But I must say I don't now, simply because I've forgotten to, which means I'm not aware of the overhearers, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I don't like the overhearers,
you get used to it.
But this is made available, but it's just stripped out to the PowerPoint and my voice, so that, I make that available. So I'm obviously happy with just my voice being out, but I don't want the video.
Funny, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, actually, I'm very resistant to audio recording, although it happens all the time, and I do allow students to do it, but I don't enjoy it.
No, I don't either.
In terms of again, not knowing who I'm talking to in a way, and then having multiple audiences, potential audiences to address.
Exactly.
Not necessarily because
it does affect you.
Just changes.
I once gave a talk to what was then the School of Interpreters in Ghent, Belgium. Students, higher education students, that's all. And they said, do you mind? They did ask, but we're going to get some of our students to practice simultaneous translation here. I could see them in the booths there. It really affected the way that I delivered the talk.
Of course,
I was acutely aware that what I said should not have too many ums and ahs, and should more or less be well-formed sentences. Otherwise I wouldn't have been aware of it. It does make a difference.
I think, knowing that they were translated, that would be an additional.
Are we moving into Goffman?
We're an hour and 10 into this discussion, so
we should probably
wrap it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.